So I think we should make a start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third session of the INFRA Plus Infrastructure for Fragmented Cities webinar series. Today, we are discussing on the broad theme of intersections. I'm Debapriya, and I will be moderating this session. Through the INFRA Plus webinar series, we have been discussing various links between the context-specific infrastructural challenges, the creative approaches to their solutions, and universal mechanisms towards improved sustainability. We have been looking at empirical cases from across the globe with speakers from East and South Asia, Latin America, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Today, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers talking on gender and mobility. Before we begin, a bit of housekeeping. Firstly, this session will be recorded and shared via the INFRA web platforms through YouTube, and you can also find the link on Twitter. There are more webinars coming up in this series through May, June, and July. You can find all the details on the Eventbrite page and on the INFRA Padlet. The Twitter hashtag for this event is #InfraPlus, for those of you who want to tweet. And for questions, you can post anonymously if you prefer in the Q&A box. You can also raise your hand to ask your questions by speaking, or you can also indicate that you have a question in the Q&A box and we can invite you to speak. So without further ado, we'll start with today's first speaker, Dr. Anna Plyushteva. Anna is the Departmental Research Lecturer in Transport Studies at the School of Geography and the Environment and the Transport Studies Unit at Oxford. Anna's research and teaching focus on urban mobility and transport infrastructures, specifically on the roles they play in the socio-material organization of cities, different forms of inequality, and gendered social and spatial relations. Anna was appointed in 2019, having previously worked as a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at the Free University at Brussels and the research associate and program coordinator at the Transport Studies Unit. Her work draws on a range of mostly qualitative methods and currently focuses on Southeast Europe and the UK. Anna's doctoral research at the University College London, funded by ESRC, focused on new ways of understanding the impact of the new metro line on commuters in Sofia, Bulgaria. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, Debapriya. Thank you very much also to Juliana and Yahia and the other speakers today. So I'm going to share my slides, which hopefully will work. Can somebody just give me a nod that you can see this okay? Okay,
perfect.
Great. Thanks. So my talk today is entitled Infrastructural Intersections and the Work of Care. And in the next 20 minutes or so, I will attempt to reflect on some aspects of thinking intersecting infrastructures, both theoretically and empirically. The context that I am focusing on is urban flood risk, so vulnerability to flooding in urban areas, but I hope that some of these reflections will have broader relevance as well. The intersecting nature of different types of infrastructures is something that I have been thinking about increasingly for the last few years. One of the big contributions of what has come to be known as the infrastructural turn in the social sciences is the recognition that infrastructures are not simply technical systems, but that they are continuously made and remade through and within socio-material relations. In this context, there are also growing efforts to open up the sectoral silos within which infrastructural systems are often imagined to be sitting. So things like water, transport, energy. And a growing body of work challenges these divisions. So trying to present infrastructures as not only made through socio-material relations, but specifically through socio-material relations which exceed and kind of span across predefined sectors. But how and by whom are infrastructural intersections brought into being? How are they sustained? How are they transformed? What we often rely on are somewhat mechanistic metaphors of these interlinkages, things like embeddedness and articulations. I draw on these, but I aim to push some of these ideas a bit further and try to explore more explicitly relational and a more explicitly critical understanding of the links between different infrastructures. My own research area is transport and mobility infrastructures are almost exclusively studied in their own sector, in their own silo. So there is an urgent need for more interdisciplinary approaches in this field, not least because transport and mobility affect every aspect of urban life, I believe. So this is the context from within which I turn to thinking with care. There is a long history of engagement with infrastructure through this lens of care in anthropology, in science and technology studies, in feminist epistemologies and human geography. And these are the sorts of traditions that I draw on here. This work encompasses a range of interrelated yet distinctive concepts: repair, maintenance, the concept of care itself, and all of these concepts have been central to a growing recognition that infrastructures are best seen and understood, not from a bird's eye view, not from the view of the technical drawing, but through paying close attention to the practices of everyday life. One of the thinkers whose work I draw on in mobilizing care for intersecting infrastructures is feminist science and technology studies scholar Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, whose scholarship in turn is often in dialogue with the work of Donna Haraway and that of Bruno Latour. In the empirical examples that I will discuss in a minute, these different dimensions of care spelt out by Puig de la Bella Casa, affective, ethical, and practical, are very clearly visible, but they're also intertwined and inseparable. This highlights the link of care to embodied physical, practical activities such as maintenance and repair, but it also hints at the fact that care is about more than that. It's about caring in the sense of being concerned about emotional and affective relations, which echoes now kind of classic work on care in human geography by Tronto and Lawson and others. So drawing further on the work of Puig de la Bella Casa, I want to articulate here how intersecting infrastructures are often both tangible empirical objects of study, but they're also theoretical lenses, devices for knowing, and in particular devices for knowing how a world's degree of livability is accomplished in practical terms in everyday life. In other words, focusing on intersecting infrastructures says something about the infrastructures themselves, but it also says something about what it takes to make living possible in a particular setting. So I bring these different dimensions together in order to explore the ways in which the concept of care makes visible the intersections of different infrastructural systems. The empirical material I will discuss today is a few years old now. Some of it has already been published, some of it is under review. And it all originates in this project called Sustainable Cities and Resilient Transport, in which we collaborated with colleagues from these different institutions, Beatriz among them. And my role within this project was to conduct comparative research on low-income areas in London and in Manila. But today I will talk about Manila in particular. So our research in Manila examined the impact of flooding on everyday mobility, and in particular on the everyday mobility of older women. And in this context, we found it increasingly difficult to think about rising water levels in isolation, and even to think about floodwater and mobility and human mobility in isolation. So our focus became the ways in which floodwater becomes involved in the socio-material arrangements and the everyday practices of an urban area, understood more broadly. We ended up defining our focus as three types of intertwined infrastructures: transport, wastewater, and domestic waste. and 4 types of interrelated mobilities, those 3, so domestic waste, wastewater and transport, plus the mobilities of floodwater itself. Our research site was Malate, one of the 6 districts of the city of Manila, which itself is part of the National Capital Region in the Philippines, or Metro Manila. Malate's population is officially around 80,000 people, and the broader metro area is around 12 million. The part of Luzon Island where Metro Manila is located is exposed to a significant risk of flooding, particularly through the rainy part of the year, influenced by the East Asian monsoon, May to October. Along with climate, the topography of the metropolitan area and its infrastructural fabric are influential in shaping flood risk. Tropical cyclones are a frequent occurrence, but runoff from less intensive storms also creates significant risks of urban flooding. And this is exacerbated by the location of the urbanized area on an isthmus, the isthmus between Manila Bay on one hand and Laguna de Bay on the other. That's a large floodplain which is crisscrossed by several rivers and also modified streams called esteros. So we conducted in-depth interviews in 4 of the 57 barangays in Malate. Barangay is the smallest administrative unit. The 4 barangays that we visited vary in size, in connections to transport and facilities, in prevalence of permanent versus temporary house building materials. They can all be considered popular neighborhoods in the words of McFarlane and Silva, so popular centers of social life that are very dense and that can be considered to be at the economic margins of the wider city. All of these settlements also trace their origins to inhabitants' home building mobilizations on previously vacant land. And these mobilizations started in response to severe shortages of affordable housing in the 1970s. While the social and economic status of inhabitants of the same barangay can vary quite a bit, what we focused on in the 4 areas were households that were poorer and who faced shared challenges, such as the recent surge in drug-related crime, and also often intensified situations of violence through the clandestine police operations, which were encouraged by President Rodrigo Duterte's so-called war on drugs. So I will discuss 3 aspects of caring at the intersections of infrastructural systems: holding together, making intersections visible, and making intersections problematic. Let's start with the first of the 3. I draw here again on science and technology studies, this time echoing John Low's idea of holding together that which does not necessarily hold together. One of the key topics that kept coming up again and again in our interviews was the role of domestic waste in aggravating flood risk in Malate. Domestic waste often found its way into the narrow streets and alleyways and ended up clogging the drain covers, which meant floodwater could not run off to the estero and its levels would rise much faster. So there were many different people who in their personal or professional capacities were concerned, or if you like, cared about this issue with domestic waste. So I'm asking here what holds together this interaction between the infrastructural circulations of household waste and those of water, and why was this interaction so fraught with friction, with risk to lives and risk to livelihoods? One dimension of this was that for a range of reasons that I don't have time to get into today, the garbage trucks which served the households in Malate had recently been rescheduled to only come in the middle of the night. It's at 3 o'clock at night that the garbage truck drops by, says Rose, one of the council members in one of the barangays. When the truck arrives, the barangay rings a bell to announce to the people that there will be garbage collection and people go take their garbage. While the people are asleep, the bell rings and they get woken up to take their garbage. This kind of care provided by the municipal workers is, as is often the case in socio-material arrangements of infrastructure, both critically important and profoundly problematic. It is the kind of care that makes better while also making worse. But drawing attention to the scheduling is my particular attention here because it makes visible the other kind of care that is going on and specifically how exhausting it is to have to walk several streets in the middle of the night to go to the edge of the neighborhood if you want to dispose of your household waste. People are very tired, Rose went on to remark. So this is one socio-material arrangement through which domestic waste ends up in the streets and in the alleyways, and so becomes an impediment for the infrastructures of wastewater and human mobility. There are others as well, but I want to briefly highlight how this kind of problematic intersection, this sort of knotting, is dealt with in the barangay's day-to-day life by the local inhabitants. So we have 2 declogging projects every year. We clean the drainages, we buy some sacks, we open the covers, and some people would clean out the drainage, including the soil and the garbage. And then they would dump the garbage. They use a shovel, and this is repeated throughout the drainage system. There was even one time when there was a flood, we saw plenty of garbage flowing with the flood and going down to the estero, and we put a net across the street to capture all of it. And then we had a fight. Some people got angry that we were preventing the garbage from flowing out to the estero. We put the net on the boundary of our barangay. People were angry because once the floodwater is no longer there, the garbage would settle in front of their houses. So you can see here how the intersection of 3 infrastructures is not a place, a thing, an articulation, but it's a kind of constant negotiation, a relation between people and objects. Feminist research on care practices highlight this type of work as the devalued ordinary labours that are crucial for making a place, a home, a neighbourhood livable. The second dimension I want to discuss is that of making infrastructural intersections visible. In other words, this is about the care that goes into expert and non-expert, and I want to highlight how problematic the distinction is here. That goes into expert and non-expert perceiving and making perceptible intersections, so pointing them out. This type of care makes intersections tangible to others, particularly those with less day-to-day investment and experience in them, such as a researcher like myself who has flown in from a different country for just a short amount of time. Here, the intersections in question are between wastewater and human transport and mobility. On the side streets, it is often difficult to get about. Over here, you are supposed to see holes in the gutters, and these holes are supposed to lead to the drainage. Some people in the other barangays have blocked these holes already because sometimes due to excessive water inside the drainage, the water coming from Quirino Avenue can come up through these holes and cause more flooding. So the water would rise very fast. Because these holes are supposed to lead the floodwater to the drain, but at the moment it is actually working in reverse. There is too much water inside, so the water is coming out. But it also means the holes are blocked and there is no way for the rainwater to drain. Here, Daniel is doing the work of making a transport and mobility researcher look closely at the drain covers in the side streets. And not only pointing them out, but really making them visible, making visible what people do with them, and also highlighting the contradictory ways in which they work. Finally, I want to briefly talk about the ways in which a focus on care makes intersecting infrastructures problematic. And in using the notion of problematic, I'm drawing here on Clive Burnett and Gary Bridges thinking problematically about the city. On this occasion, I don't even use a pseudonym to explain who shared the story for reasons that will become apparent. This is an interview which began with a very proud account of a new drainage that was put in one of the barangays. So unlike some of the neighboring areas, this barangay had a new wastewater and rainwater system, I was told. And in the course of the interview, as everyone got more comfortable and more issues were brought up, a different perspective was offered. Actually, the old drainage is still here. The new drainage was a project of a congressman. One new large pipe, 1 meter in diameter, going through the neighborhood. It's made of concrete. The new drainage was just laid on top of the old pipes. In fact, I think the old drainage is even better than the new. After the new drainage was put in, that's when it started flooding in this area. Before that, it didn't really flood. But now, if it rains just a few minutes, we'll already see a little bit of flood. Maybe they put the new pipe just in order to solve the flooding in this major road nearby, so that the water from there can flow down to the Estero. So here, a national politician received publicity and recognition for intervening to help a low-income area by ensuring that new drainage was put in. However, as it clearly became evident to local inhabitants very quickly, the project was about diverting water through the neighborhood and not from it. The pipe's purpose was to reduce flooding in a major road from which local inhabitants hardly benefit themselves. It's actually the contrary. The avenue is a dangerous, car-dominated space to traverse on the way to school, to the market, to work, and those journeys are generally made on foot. The key users of the avenue and the key publics, which I assume the congressman was looking to please, are the wealthier groups reliant on private cars for their everyday mobility, for whom flooding in the avenue represents sort of frustrating delays. So the pipe, which aimed to resolve this problem, was laid on top of the existing drainage, in the process exacerbating flood risk and thus immobility within the barangay. Which leads me to my reasons for kind of emphasizing the work dimension of care. The key challenge of studying how people encounter, navigate, and challenge infrastructural intersections is the danger of romanticizing these practices of infrastructural care. Care can and often is also about marginalizing, about violence, silencing, and exclusion. It is about the privilege of caring, being able to care, and about the privilege of being cared for. Again, I'm citing Puig de la Bella Casa here. By focusing on work, I actively resist overly romantic ideas of infrastructural weaving and caring by making visible the arduous, the uncomfortable, the compulsory, the often unsafe ways in which infrastructural intersections are enacted and experienced. What are the embodied consequences for people who encounter, who hold together, who build bridges? In answering this question, I position infrastructural intersections within a growing body of research which traces the embodied work of enacting infrastructures through daily practices, continuously rematerializing infrastructures, their borders, and their relations with human and non-human bodies. It's possible that aspects of this seem a bit abstract to those of you who are more practically minded, and I would like to say that I share many of these practical concerns. The way I approach many of these questions is ultimately about a concern with how different forms of human and non-human mobilities in cities are governed, and how these arrangements of governance can accommodate, be more sensitive to the fact that infrastructural systems and processes do not neatly fit into their own sectors. I think that what thinking with care does is it invites scholars and practitioners to look closely at the edges of the infrastructures that they research and practice, really contemplate these edges in order to identify links and continuities which maybe had not been visible before. And to return to Puig de la Bella Casa once more and her conversation with the work of Latour, the work of studying infrastructural intersections, just like the work of maintaining them, can also be conceived as a work of care, a kind of everyday labor, which is itself a worry and an ethical obligation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Anna, for your beautiful presentation. So we are expecting questions, and I would just like to remind the audience that you can put your questions in the quick Q&A box, or you may raise a hand so that we can ask questions directly to you. So
I have a question. Can I ask, or afterwards?
Yes, go on, ask.
Yes, thank you for this presentation. I think I found it very interesting. I was wondering, also looking at the work that we do, if you were able to use also the result of your research to influence policy or to open also conversation at the policy level. So I think you collect interesting data and quotes. Did you have the possibility to present it at, I don't know, to local policymakers, or you are planning to do that?
Thank you very much for your question, Giulia. So this expansive project had various different components. What I'm discussing today is maybe kind of the more theoretical contribution that we tried to make. We're very fortunate to work with partners from a local university in Manila, De La Salle University, people who have more experience of engineering, so that sort of perspective on infrastructures. And that institution has a long history of working directly with city level and national decision makers. So I think in terms of kind of contribution to policy, theirs was the most significant one. But in terms of our side, I guess it's more of a kind of question, provocation, rather than a direct contribution to policy. But to me, it's about this question of how to govern infrastructures which kind of spill out of these neat boxes that we put them into, transport, energy, food, water. So how to make sense of them, how to open them up for debate, how to open them up for decisions if they kind of resist these categorizations when you look at them from the perspective of everyday practices.
Thank you.
We don't see any more questions in the question and answer box. Oh yeah, Norma has a comment. She says, or Norma, you want to say this yourself, or do you want me to read it out? Yeah, okay, I will read it out. So Norma says, the approach that your team adopted in this project is amazing, Anna. Congratulations. Yes, of course.
Thank you, Norma. That's really kind. I will be happy to have further conversations about this approach because it's still very much work in progress. So happy to have dialogues about it and develop it further.
Can I ask something very, very quickly, realizing that we're almost on to the next talk, but I just wonder, how does this fit with the other parts of the project? As in, you said, it's part of a much more complex, larger work. So how does it fit? What is the precise contribution that it is making, or what is the larger aim of the project?
Thank you for this challenging question, because as I said, it's quite an expansive project which kind of both holds together around this idea of resilience and sustainability, but also kind of allows work in quite a few different directions. But for me, one of the very interesting ways in which things fit together is this concept of care, which in both human geography and science and technology studies has been critiqued also for kind of almost being everything, because care relations are so fundamental to everything we do to kind of sustain life that as a kind of theoretical device, a bit like infrastructure, they have kind of come to represent everything. And I personally don't have a big problem with that. And so within the project, we used care also in a completely different way to talk very specifically about the caring that older women do and how their kind of day-to-day mobilities are interwoven with practices of care, not infrastructural care, but caring for members of their household and being recipients of caring practices themselves. So almost kind of the other end of the range of different ways in which you can use care.
Thank you.
So we are doing very great on time. So if there are no more questions at the moment, so we can move on to the next speaker. And if we have time at the end, we can have a combined round of questions. And to all the audience listening, and if you want to type your question, you can also introduce yourself in the chat box while you're putting your questions. It would be nice to have an interactive session that way as well. So quickly moving on to our next speaker, Giulia Maci. Giulia is an urban planner specialized in gender-sensitive city development, youth engagement, and community-based action planning, with work experience in more than 20 countries across Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America. Currently, she works as an urban specialist in Cities Alliance UNOPS in Brussels, coordinating the Cities for Women global program that focuses on increasing girls' and women's engagement in urban development and governance through participatory planning and design processes. Giulia is also Institute Associate at the Institute for Culture and Society, Western Sydney University. Giulia has been the Italian coordinator for the Dialogue 5+5 in the Mediterranean region for the promotion of exchanges and city projects focusing on circular economy and citizens' inclusion. Prior to this, she has worked as researcher and consultant for different international organizations developing and leading urban projects. Over to you, Giulia.
Thank you for this introduction, and thank you also for inviting me to this conference. My presentation is quite different from the first one. So I come from a practitioner background. Let me share the screen. Can you see it? Can you see?
Yes, yes.
Yes. So, so my presentation today will focus on why and how we can plan cities that are more responsive to women's needs. So I will keep like a citywide approach to gender equality. As has been said, I'm leading the global program called the Cities for Women, a Cities Alliance. For the ones that don't know Cities Alliance, we are part of the UN, but we are a global partnership that includes national states, but also association of cities, NGOs, especially working with urban poor and informal settlements, and also academia. So we are a partnership that focuses on promoting sustainable urban planning and including urban poor into the city making process. So I will just give you a bit an overview of the work of our program, the latest work and our approach. But first of all, as a planner, I love cities, and of course we can see now the majority of people live in cities, more than 50%, and in the future this number will increase, and people of course move to cities looking for economic opportunity, job opportunity, education, but also freedom, new rights, and ideas. The problem is that the current ways cities are planned and built means that entire groups are cannot access to this freedom, these services that cities provide. And inequalities are really built in our cities, in our neighborhood, in our streets. And gender inequality, in particular, really are at the center of this inequality. And I strongly believe that if we are able to identify, understand, and address gender inequalities, we will be able really to create cities that are more equal, livable, and accessible to all. So the first point is really looking at cities from a different perspective. I think data is key, no? So understanding the cities from completely different, a different point of view. Inequalities in cities are related to public spaces, for instance, is quite obvious. Women don't feel comfortable in public space in general. We don't have many data on that, mainly city level data, so quite scattered. But we know that women don't feel comfortable because of a real risk of being sexually harassed. 92% of women in Rabat in Morocco have experienced sexual harassment in public spaces, and this number is not different from the ones in many other cities around the world. So for an actual risk, but also for cultural and traditional norms. So women tend to pass by and use public space just to do everyday activities, such as bringing kids to school, going to work, going for shopping, but they don't use them for recreational scope, but just to interact, to really enjoy the social dimension of public space. So this is the first type of inequality. Economic inequalities, which is of course key. Everyone now talks a lot about gender-based violence. Is quite discussed in public spaces, but also domestic violence. We know that domestic violence is increasing also during the COVID time, but this is interlinked, of course, with the economic empowerment and engagement. As Cities Alliance, we work a lot in informal settlements and with the informality in general, which represent, in terms of economic informality, the majority of the economy in many cities. Women are the majority of informal workers worldwide. So this exposes them to higher risk, higher economic and health risk. Also in terms of asset control, still women represent only 13% of land and housing owners. So this may make them more vulnerable to also to eviction, for instance. This is also true for basic services. That's been mentioned. Transportation is, of course, key. The way transportation is designed doesn't take into account the specific need of women, that normally they move also more into the neighborhood rather than commuting back and forth. So they do much more stops. And of course, public transport are still unsafe. This is also true, for instance, for water collection. The 80% of the responsibility, 80% of the households without access to water falls. The responsibility of collecting water falls to women. So they have to do multiple trips a day to collect water, and this, of course, result in time poverty. So less time for education, less time for jobs and economic activities. Toilets is another key topic and issue. The majority of people that don't have access to toilets are women, and also the toilets are not designed for women's need, and this exposes them also even more to, for example, sexual assault. So all these inequalities and all these topics, they are really not part of the political agenda, overlooked when we do policies at the city level and national level. We don't have enough data. We don't have sex disaggregated data. And this is also due to the lack of political representation. So women still represent the minority. I think now it's more than 10%, but will be 13% of mayors worldwide are women. But this doesn't mean that women don't participate politically. Actually, women have been leading political movement and protest worldwide through social media. We can think about the Me Too movement, Un violador en su camino in Chile, to raise issues related to women empowerment and gender equality. They've been also leading and protest in public spaces. We can think about all the protests in Poland, in Turkey, in Tunis, in India, and so on, demanding and asking for more rights and for more services. So they are actually participating in the politics of cities, and also in terms of grassroots movement. Women are leading many associations and many organizations are drivers, in fact, of change. In our work recently, during the past year, we've been working a lot in supporting communities affected by the lockdown, and women has been key in reaching the right people with the right support. So the problem is really to design city making in a different way, and also participatory process in a different way, so that women can really participate and in this process, in the decision making. So we have to go from a traditional city planning that we know is more kind of focus on master planning, designing, and having like a fixed vision and mostly done by male urban experts, to a future of planning which is gender inclusive, based on community-based data. As I said, the majority of the cities in fact considering informal, so we have to involve community to gather data, and we need sex disaggregated data, and also process which are open, more strategic, and involve women all the way along, from design to implementation and maintenance of infrastructure. And I really believe that the gender sensitive planning and gender is one of the key transformative aspects of the future of our cities and of our society. So if we are able to imagine cities for women, we are de facto creating cities that are more equal for anyone, no? Regardless of race, class, and physical ability. These are, for example, some of the proposals, no, that we collect during our project, and you can see proposals that came from women from different community, and from cycling lines, public toilets, walkable place, community-based childcare. All these elements at the end are related to the ideal, an ideal, sustainable, and inclusive cities. So we have in our work, in every project that we do, we place women at the center. So we have developed really a process that we try to follow. Is sometimes we only do a phase 1 or a phase 2 in the project. Sometimes we do all of it. We engage women, especially women from an informal community from the beginning, also through the collection of data, the co-creation and co-design of specific intervention, and also in the evaluation of the impact. So we have developed also setting indicators to see the impact of what we do on women, and then we work a lot on advocacy, political advocacy at the local level and the global level. When we talk about assessment, we work on with surveys, through participatory debate. Over the past years, Cities Alliance has worked a lot with settlement forum, in informal settlement, with city forum, so at a different level, and also national urban forum. And all this assessment and information will feed into policy making. So we worked on the city development strategy, plans, policy proposal, but also pilot intervention and infrastructure. So just quickly, very quickly, I want just to show you how we developed a series of indicators with different questions. So really look at, before we were talking about the intersectionality of infrastructure. Exactly, so we look at the city from different perspectives, and women engagement also from different perspectives, looking at, for instance, mobility, but also economic opportunity, training, cultural policy, public spaces. We use surveys, we use different tools to engage women, also using social media. And we also organize participatory planning process where we ask actually women to evaluate their level of engagement in different aspects of the city life. We also use when we look at space, especially neighborhood level, gender-based community mapping, where we really look at preferred spot or obstacle, safety issues, to really understand how women use public space and urban space, We use a lot women's safety audit. This is something, a methodology that's been used quite a lot. We try to adapt also to the context of informal settlements, and also photo walk or design walk, where we actually work with the community, with women, and we ask them to picture or to take an image that is particularly representative of their interaction with that specific space. And this is also helps also women to develop their story in that specific neighborhood, in that specific city, and this is very important. So we are working a lot with storytelling, for instance, and capturing also the memories and the ideas of women in that specific neighborhood. These are also methodologies that exist, and we try to adapt to the context where we are working. Right now, we are currently working in different cities. So this year, using more or less the same approach, mostly in Africa, and then we have a project in Kathmandu. So exactly in Nepal, I'm going very quickly, and then if you have questions, we can discuss further. We have done a participatory local action research, so different laboratories, and a survey to capture the experience and the issues of women living in Kathmandu. And now we are working with the national government in developing a program at the national level for the national urban strategy, and with specific project in cities led by women. And one of the big topic that came out in Kathmandu was public space design, which will be the target of also an intervention. In Banjul, in Gambia, Gambia is is a country quite small, but that is changing fast. The mayor of Banjul is a woman, and she's very keen on gender topic and gender equality. And we have also engaged women from different community through radio show, the organization of radio show, phone calls, because there was also COVID, WhatsApp messages to gather their views. And now the aspect of gender and their proposal are really included in the Greater Banjul Plan, which will be presented soon in October. And currently we are also discussing also with the local authority a follow-up program after the plan, focusing on infrastructure and public space. In Liberia we have in a long-term presence in Liberia. We engaged women in 4 informal settlements. We really map the space from women perspective, identify key issues, and we develop together also here the city development strategy, including women perspective. And right now we are building water kiosk with the little shops also for women. And this water kiosk are built with women also through training, and they will maintain and will manage the water kiosk in their community. So we did the gender audit, and so we try always to have this city level work and then going into the detail with specific work on infrastructure. So this is one of the water kiosks. And we also worked in Liberia on the COVID response. We developed really a campaign for COVID awareness, and we also focus a lot on the gender implication of the crisis, focusing on gender-based violence, and also support women that were, of course, carrying the burden of this crisis at home, with children at home and so on. We are also recently also worked in Uganda. In Uganda, Cities Alliance is carrying a project around a big infrastructure, a major African infrastructure, supporting the safeguard part. So really supporting community that will be evicted from the construction of this infrastructure, and we supporting mainly women in this process. And in Uganda, we recently organized a citywide participatory process, and we will publish the report tomorrow, I think. So you can have a look. And we are also there building biofuel toilets, also through the engagement of women. This is one of the area of the intervention, which is a market in Kampala. And in Tunisia, we are currently doing a project that is called Femme Medina. We look at the Medina of Tunis. We just concluded the first component, which was a big participatory assessment in the Medina. We did the surveys, we did specific workshop in different neighborhoods, we did the walks, we gathered data, we designed the map. There was no digital map of the Medina, so we tried also to include women's perception in this map. And we also identify with women specific intervention in public space, and they go from toilet to training center to specific place where women can also sell their work. Apparently, women are working a lot for the souk, so they are producing products, but in reality are always men that go and sell, so they are the face in the souk. But women have a key role. Economic role in the Medina. So we will start also the implementation very soon. And in Tunisia, we are also working in other cities, supporting gender mainstreaming in local policy, especially looking at gender budgeting, which is a key topic. So how to develop municipal budget with gender in mind to prioritize women-led projects and women-focused projects. And we are also supporting women leadership because in Tunisia, like similarly to Nepal, a recent law made, I think was in 2017, allowed women to run for the election and even have equal representation in electoral list. But so now there are many women elected, but the problem is capacity, is support, is time. So we are working on it. And then I invite you to read, because we are also trying to gather this experience and this data into publications. Also to influence in general global debate. So we are engaged with the Gender Action Plan of the European Union, but also with the G20. So trying to use the stories of the women on the ground, city stories, and showing how a city planned and conceived by women look like. So thank you. I don't know if you have any specific, I went quite quickly through all this intervention, so I don't know if you have any questions or clarification.
May I ask a question, Debapriya, and maybe somebody, and Beatriz has also a question. But since I'm here already, I can start. I just decided. So Giulia, absolutely fascinating. I would be very interested in the gritty bitty bits of doing this kind of work. I mean, it sounds amazing, it looks fantastic, but I just wonder, because over the last few years, what I hear a lot and what I read a lot is always if men had to take care of water, for instance, then every household would have tap water by now, or we would long have solved the sanitation challenge if men had to clean the households human waste and so on and so on. But obviously these things don't change. They don't change easily. They're very ingrained in cultures. They're very ingrained in societies. And going in and doing this work is clearly of enormous value. But what does it involve really on the ground? Like how much cultural understanding, interpersonal skill, I don't know what to call it, is necessary in order to really introduce transformative change? How do you negotiate this change? How do you, those are too many questions to ask in one go, but maybe start somewhere and then we can have the deeper discussions at a different time. But I'm just curious about how to actually go about implementing transformative change in this many different contexts that are all very, very different from each other, even though they have common challenges, obviously.
Thank you for the question. It's a question that I ask myself every day. Just bear in mind that this is a global program, but then we have also country program. So when I work in Liberia, we have a country program that is working constantly there, and we normally tend to select places where we can have a long-term engagement politically at the city level, but also the national level. So we don't only work with community, but we keep always the dialogue also with the national government, exactly to ensure kind of long-term change. So in Liberia, for instance, we have been working for many years right now. So we know we have a very good relations, for example, with communities. With informal communities. We work a lot with SDI, which is Islam Dweller International, is our member, and we are always working with them. So also women-led organizations, which are part of the network, and we always support them in the process of institutionalization of their work. So as I said, we've been working on creating this settlement forum. And then the settlement forum representative goes to the city forum, and then the representative city forum goes to the national urban policy. So always to keep this relation going on. So the long-term aspect and the political engagement is key. Then my experience is that in any case, when you need data, you need to have stories. You need to find also the good entry point. And I think somehow public space, for example, infrastructure planning is a good entry point to talk about gender. When we talk about violence or cultural norms, is much more difficult, but this entry point is somehow easier to manage because it's like such a political issue related to religion and so on. So the experience in Tunisia is also quite key. So they're quite resistant in talking about gender, and also I don't want to be too long, but yes, we have a mayor in Tunis, which is the first mayor in the Arab world. So she has a very big responsibility to carry, but at the same time, she's under a big pressure, no? So instead of talking in general about women, gender equality, we talk about making public spaces more active, more inclusive towards everyone, not only to women, but to everyone, starting with women ideas. And then we also involve everyone. So there was a lot of political engagement behind that. It was not only about the design of the infrastructure. It's not that. It's really how to convince people. It was very difficult to convince that was so important to do it. And the process is key more than even the outcome somehow. But still is challenging. In Nepal as well, for example, after this, when we show also data and analysis, the government has been quite open and keen, even if we criticize them. So we had a lot of critique to work on it. So it's also important to find also the right interlocutor in that. And then the aspect of funding. So you need to raise funding to convince donor. And I think the Cities Alliance is in a good position for that, because we also have member state and donors in our membership. So to connect the two. And we always try to also work on co-finance model. So to have also, for example, the municipality of the government also to invest a bit and not just coming in with a bit of money and we do it. But of course, this takes a lot of time. And yeah.
Yeah, we have a question from Beatriz. Yeah, go on.
Sorry, so just to add also, we are really trying to work a lot on our Mella, so monitoring, evaluation, and learning part, so the learning as well. So trying also to see the impact on the ground, learn, and then adapt also the way we work. And we are discussing a lot internally now, because we are working on the new strategy, on how to make sure to also go back to the place, or in any case, if we are there already, to analyze after a couple of years the impact and to keep the conversation going. And since we have a local presence, this is feasible somehow. Sorry.
No, actually, my question was really related to the last part of your answer. It was basically, how do you incorporate different stakeholders in your approach, and how do you work with academia? Probably that's the part that you might want to implement a little bit, because I think the work is fascinating, but at the same time, I think there are many pieces of the work in academia that can also help in this type of project. So I was just wondering, how do you manage to make everything converge in this?
Yeah, thank you for this. This is another relevant question. So in every time that we start a project, we do what is called the stakeholder mapping. No? So we start to identify what are the actors important for that specific project. We do what is called theory of change. So in order to get that specific outcome and result, what are the key actors to involve? Then, as I said, since we are there, we have also some actors, somehow we always involve. Local authorities are always involved, because it's really our core of our mandate. Normally community, especially informal workers, we are working a lot with WIGO, which is the Association of Women working in informal sector. And we are working with SDI, so they are quite at the center of our work. So the urban poor, what is called urban poor. We are not very good in involving private sector, and I think we should do much more in the future. Finding also a way to involve them into the financing, but also into the work. But this is, yes, this is what we do. And we change also the target more or less, and the stakeholder group in the different area and different according to the different project.
We have more questions coming in from on the question and answer box. There's a question from Purva asking about what sort of challenges you face while working with communities, especially working with women from marginalized communities, and what sort of strategies you had to adopt to bypass or unsettle these existing power structures.
It depends really on the context. Maybe I can use maybe an example of Tunisia. That is something that we are really concluding right now. The aspect of gender is extremely politicized and also related to religion in the case of Tunisia. So and there are also competing interests also at the community level. So what we try to do is, first of all, meeting separately the different groups, and then having moment also together. So having this kind of strategy also to have private conversation to understand really what do they want, understanding their interest. So we have to find, it's really understanding what are the interests of all these stakeholders around the table, and trying to respond to the different interests. And then, even if we have already an idea, trying to adapt. So there is a phase, kind of baseline phase, where we try also to build a bit. There is not a lot of flexibility in the way we work in general, the UN in general, but we try to be a bit flexible to adapt also slightly the project to the need and to the suggestion of the different stakeholders. So in the case of Medina, also we adapted at the beginning. We had an idea at the beginning, and then we adapted a bit. So I think flexibility is key, having this specific dialogue in different way to engage. Another maybe point I think is important to make is that I mentioned also in my presentation very quickly the participatory process. How normally the participatory process are made are with evening meeting, for instance, or one-day meeting. We try to do, for example, the same meeting in the morning and in the evening to allow women to participate. The fact is, for example, in Tunis, in the Medina, so women don't like, for example, to go in cafes or places like that because are quite maid-dominated. So we meet either in the house or really in the street, in like a specific place where they just go to pick up their kids and so on. We do also phone calls, so also where people are also more like easy to speak. And then we use some, last year we used radio as well, where also people can call and just share their stories. So.
I'm slightly concerned about the time. So there are more questions coming in the question and answer section. So if you could, Giulia, answer those questions personally in the question and section, and we can move on to Beatriz, our next speaker. Yeah. So moving on, our next speaker is Dr. Beatriz Mella Lira. Beatriz is a postdoctoral researcher at the BRT Plus Center for Excellence, Department of Transport Engineering, and postdoctoral researcher at CEDEUS, Center for Sustainable Urban Development, Pontificia, Universidad, Católica de Chile. She has a PhD in planning studies from the Bartlett School of Planning, UCL. She's an architect with a master's degree in urban development from Pontificia, Universidad, Católica de Chile. Her main research interests are urban planning, transport planning, gender, well-being, social equity, multi-criteria social impact assessment, and capability approach. Beatriz has ongoing research collaborations with academics in Chile, UK, Colombia, Germany, Brazil, Canada, and Turkey, leading or being part of research projects. In Chile, she has developed collaborative relationships at the local level to strengthen local participation channels in the context of sanitary crisis. In the past, she has collaborated with local and metropolitan governments to generate local public policies in Colombia, Philippines, and Sierra Leone. She has a strong background and research skills on qualitative, quantitative, and participatory methods. Beatriz is currently working as a lecturer at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile and the Universidad del Desarrollo, sorry, forgive my Spanish, please, in modules related to urban planning and research methods. She has been guest lecturer and teaching assistant at UCL and a visiting lecturer at University of Westminster for modules related to sustainable development and transport planning. She's been supervisor of MSc dissertations of more than 30 transportation planning students in UCL and University of Westminster. And as for private consulting, she has worked with German agency GIZ and the OECD as external consultant. The projects have focused on the management, development of sustainable mobility in the global south and accessibility metrics. She was project manager at Urbanica Consultores, leading projects related to accessibility, urban planning and design, land use and sustainable transport, and having experience in coordinating and managing human and economic resources, interactions with clients, proposal development, quality control, and deliverables. So over to you, Beatriz.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the nice introduction. I'm very glad to be presenting today because I'll be talking about mobility infrastructure in Latin America and how this intersects with challenges for building sustainable cities, considering the improvement of walkability, intermodality, electric public transport. I'm aiming to present this today addressing the main challenges for the region and specifically focus on issues of social inequalities as well. So there. The structure of the presentation will be in 3 parts. First, I will show how the social and the epidemiological context has impacted in Latin America. In the second part, I will show how mobility has changed in this scenario. And the third part will be related to the main challenges and some of the ideas that could help in this situation. So first of all, about the context. Sorry. About the context. Several countries in Latin America have faced political and social protests in the recent years, triggered by a deep historical social inequalities, and not only about the city, not only about transport infrastructure, lack of facilities. Can you see my... Lack of facilities, basic services, but also profound inequalities related to economic and social models, pension systems, low salaries, unemployment, among many other things. So without going any further, today, Colombia is going through a deep social crisis, which has brought consequences on public, political, and social order. And I sympathize with all the people who have suffered violence in these days and families of those who have been injured in current protest. And something similar happened here in Chile with the social outburst, people demanding a transformation in the pension system and uprising against all historic inequalities. So massive social movements exploded on October 2019 and continued to demonstrate week after week for a long period of time. And although the same protests have not been equal in Argentina, for example, as in Chile or Colombia, the current economic and political moment in Argentina has been defined as a crisis. Poverty reached 36% in the second half of 2019, and they're expecting poverty to rise to almost 45% during the pandemic. So in Latin America has become one of the hotspots for the pandemic, exacerbated by weak social protection, many of the things that I said before, structural inequalities in the health system, very deep inequalities at the end. The GDP has dropped in 8%, but before the pandemic, the region's development already faced severe limitations: poverty, vulnerability to climate change and natural disasters as well, violence, which is also related to Giulia's presentation, and various other negative social indicators. Women have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, and this is something that we know in many of the cities in the region. They've had to face more responsibility with family and have taken care care roles more than men. And despite this, violence against women has exacerbated, doubling, tripling, or quadrupling domestic violence in some cases. So it's ridiculous. In Brazil, the epidemiological context is the main challenge. The country exceeds a new threshold of victims. More than 400,000 people have died out of COVID. And on the other hand, equity is a common denominator among Latin American countries. The graph here shows, for example, data on how the Gini index is distributed in Latin American countries. This Gini coefficient measures the deviation of socioeconomic income. It should be 0 when it's really, really equal, and 100 when it's totally unequal. And Brazil's Gini coefficient was 53 in 2017, followed by Honduras. El Salvador recorded the lowest Gini coefficient. But at the end, Latin America, like other developing regions in the world, generally records very high rates of inequality. And we know that the redistribution of tax or via tax reforms have proved not to help economies as much as they do in developed countries. And health and education system have proved to be better, for example, in improving the Gini coefficient. However, we also know that the Gini is only a reflection of wealth and does not cover all other dimensions in human development. So how mobility has changed in this scenario? So the context of the pandemic has strongly impacted people's perceptions regarding the use of public transport, or almost, but especially public transport. During 2020 and now in 2021, together with my team in the BRT Plus Center of Excellence, we have had the opportunity to develop research to assess people's perceptions in 9 different Latin American cities. And we studied many things about COVID impacting on transport, like modes they used before and now, how their activities changed, how they telework today, and how they assess the government approach, for example, to the pandemic, how they face new mobility scenarios, and many among other issues. But for example, this first graph shows how model choice has shifted before the pandemic and after in 5 out of the 9 cities that we explored. The immobility in the right produced by the pandemic reflects an average of 59% of immobility. So this is part of the confinement and massive reduction of mobility. Buenos Aires, for example, is the city that most decreased urban mobility, with 67% not performing any trips when we did the survey. And Lima is the city that decreased the least mobility, so with only 39% of immobility during quarantine. So Santiago, for example, and Rio de Janeiro reflect the most significant changes towards private transportation, and this is a big issue. The biggest shift towards active modes, walking and cycling, is registered in Lima. They shifted almost 9% of their trips to active modes during the pandemic. Rio de Janeiro, for example, showed the lowest change toward active modes, and this is a concern. In general, changes from other modes to public transport are very low in all cities, so anyone wants to shift to public transport anymore. Lima is the city of the public transport user stayers, because 31% of those survived in that city continue to use public transport for their trips, even in times of quarantines. So the option of switching to public transport is at least the least likely to happen in the context of the pandemic. And if people didn't continue using their usual mode, the first option to shift tends to be the car, private modes, which will produce a short and medium-term extreme impacts on Latin American cities. And here the graphs are part of the same study and the same survey, and they show the concern of the interviewees about hygiene in public transport. So this is another issue, big issue for public transport. And the graph in green shows a relatively broad and consensual concern regarding the use of public transport in all cities studied, with more intensity of concern in the case of Santiago and Lima. And if we remember, Lima were the stayers in public transport, so they had to use it anyways. And this concern considers both mobile people in the different public, private, and active modes during the pandemic, and immobile people, not making daily trips to the primary activity. And it's interesting to see how this level of concern for hygiene in public transport varies, particularly for people who remain immobile. So in the other graph, in yellow, we see the immobile people, and in blue, all the other modes. And in Santiago, Lima, and Rio de Janeiro, immobile people tend to be more afraid of using public transport than the average user. This may impact on how we approach captive public transport users, since we will have to overcome significant barriers to promote this type of transport, especially concerning public health. So jumping to the third part of the presentation, what are the main challenges then, and some ideas to succeed? And I think it's interesting to see, going back to the topic of the presentation about infrastructure, that we can see soft and resilient infrastructure promoting active transport, and then hard or safe and clean public transport infrastructure. So the first one, the soft and resilient, is for designing cities for people, focusing on sustainable mobility, universal mobility, favoring walking, active transport, building cycle lanes, cycling mobility infrastructure. And the second part is safe or hard and clean public infrastructure. This is not necessarily only a concern for Latin American countries. I think this is part of a global concern to create more safe, equitable, and sustainable public transport. And I will show some ideas that might help with this challenge. So first, with the soft and resilient active transport, I think it's important to invest in cycle infrastructure and bicycle promotion campaigns. The bicycle has grown exponentially in pandemic times. Investing in cycle infrastructure and bicycle promotion in various social groups, it's a part of a long-term adaptation. So this is also about promotion in a way that, along with walkability, has a series of other health, climate, energy, social, cultural benefits, among others. So here, for example, in the left, we have the image of 2020 cover for the New Yorker. And this was unthinkable in previous years. And on the right, an expansion of cycling infrastructure. In Bogota, for example, 76 kilometers of temporary cycling lanes were built on the main streets, adding to the 550 kilometers permanent cycling lanes. In Mexico City has proposed 130 kilometers of temporary cycling lanes. And the same has happened in Lima and several other cities in the world, in Santiago as well. And there is an increasing number in many cities of the region. So among the medium-term challenges for the use of the bicycle, I proposed first, a prioritization of laws and regulations for zero deaths, goal, and road accidents. This should emphasize the current and new laws and aiming to reduce accidents between motorized and non-motorized vehicles with a zero death vision on road accidents. I think we have to fight for a reduction of maximum speeds. We need strategies for reducing speed to 30 kilometers per hour. Second, the construction of more cycling infrastructure and pedestrian improvements through central or local governments, depending on the cities and the countries. These plans should be financed in the short term and prioritizing the connection to existing infrastructure. Everyone should be able to cycle. Third, articulate a cycle route system with educational infrastructure, and this is thinking in the long term and for the new generations. This encouraging active mobility at an early age. And fourth, subsidies for the first bicycle and cargo bicycles. And cargo bicycles, we know, is related to mobilities of care. A subsidy program should enable purchasing and maintaining cycles, the same for electric assistance cycles. And tax benefits for example, local manufacturers, companies, and organizations that subsidize the acquisition and maintenance of cycles. Cycling shouldn't be a luxury. So I think it's important to think this as a change in the paradigm of the use of the street for physical and social activity. So this means closing certain streets to cars to have wider, ventilated, accessible and flexible spaces for pedestrian and cyclists. The closure of the streets, motorized vehicles, will allow more space for physical and recreational activity. It will allow enough space for avoiding physical contact exposures for COVID, and setting sports time and closing the streets favor the quarantine phase and transition phases towards new reopenings. Then in Chile, in Peru, Colombia, there's this franja horaria that have allowed quarantine people to circulate on the street to exercise. So this is about collected permits only to corresponding to a couple of hours a day, and had only you can only travel by foot or by cycle to exercise. In Colombia, for example, the measure also regulates the distance of 1 kilometer from home for exercising. In Buenos Aires, for example, the vicinity of parks and squares are close to cars, allowing people to exercise freely. Sorry. And the good thing about these measures are that they're free, they're not expensive, and any communal or local budgets can support this. And this is a good way for recognizing physical activity and the use of streets and public spaces as a social priority. And during 2018 and 19, I had the opportunity to develop a qualitative research interviewing cyclist women in Latin America. And I really wanted to show you this because I interviewed leaders, academics, activists working on promoting cycle in their own context, all of these cities in Latin America. And the idea was to explore emotive and instrumental well-being for women cyclists. And the results were amazing and are published, and I can share the link. And this has led to a second part of the research, which is the work we're currently doing now, which is a survey for of preferences and perceptions of women cyclists in Latin America. So this is the quantitative part of the research. So what we want to do here is to understand the perception and hierarchies of value attributed to the elements of urban space, to diagnose how the bicycle impacts more subjective dimensions of life, considering, for example, mental health, self-esteem, freedom, among others, and to understand the type of user and the type of urban cyclist women they are. And so what we're doing is that we're collecting some data during May and June this year in different cities, and we found our partners, our allies in these cities already with a couple of workshops we've already done. And this interesting, very interesting work that we're doing, and probably we can share it in another opportunity. So to start wrapping up with the second idea of the hard, safe and clean public transport, we should be able to promote safe, equitable and sustainable public transport in the long term. So it's important to capture the learnings of the COVID era to improve the travel standards and expanded opportunities for public transport users. And for this, I propose three ideas. The first one is related to clean energy for the transport sector. We should be able to think about electric buses in the region. The second, affordable public transport should be affordable to everyone. And the third one is COVID-free public transport, and probably this is the most challenging one. So the clean energy for the transport sector is this idea of the electric buses. Santiago, for example, is a good case for transferring to other contexts in the region. And probably some of the key elements that could help this transferability to other cities in Latin America are the long-term vision about the benefits of electrification, the clarity and the contracts, or the clarity in the role between the operators and the state, and the contracts with the energy providers. And this, I think these three elements can allow all the countries to promote these public policies eventually, considering all these and moving forward in this area. The second idea was this affordable public transport. In this context, is relevant for social inequity. In some contexts, for example, the expenses in transport are sometimes disproportionate for for vulnerable segments. For example, in the case of Lima, a family can spend an average of 22% of the minimum salary on transport. And this graph shows Santiago, where the segment with the highest income spend no more than 2% of monthly family expenses on transport. And on the contrary, the monthly expenses on transport can represent 30% of family income for the most vulnerable people. So the challenge is to make public transportation affordable to everyone. And it can't be that families are spending more than 30% of their income in transportation. So probably a transport subsidy to the families don't spend more than 15-20% of the family budget of public transport, and getting as closer as possible to the most vulnerable families to spend probably zero on transportation. And the third idea is having this COVID-free public transport. In academia, this is a consensus that promoting public transport is good and critical to reduce greenhouse emissions and improve environmental conditions and quality of life for people. But due to the pandemic, people use less and more, and they have more fear about public transport. So one of the current general recommendations is to promote surface public transport modes, since buses have constant ventilation and air circulates. The stations must keep open, operate with maximum capacities, increase frequencies, even if the operators don't like this, and limit the minimum distance between the buses, within the buses and between people. And education campaigns so that people know how to behave safely in these spaces with self-care and using public transport. But also in general terms, it's necessary to articulate messages through appropriate public policies to attract different public and private sectors in solving the problem, to prioritize public transport as a structural model of transportation in cities. So I'd like to end up with this idea, focusing the efforts and the research and policy making in thinking about transport infrastructure as much more than building highways in the city, focusing on soft and resilient active transport and safe and clean public transport. And these are, I think, the main challenges for Latin American cities, because this infrastructure will help the many dimensions of equity, helping in the social, climate, and epidemiological circumstances. So that was my presentation. And I'm sorry if I go very close to the time.
Thank you, Beatriz. I think I can quickly move on to a question, and it is about post-pandemic cities and cycling. So there's a question in the question and answer box, and it says, on the design aspect of post-pandemic cities, I wonder how we can also make the gendered experiences of these infrastructures in cities in a more balanced, that while cities need to promote resilience and strength to recover, we can also see cities and the people living in it become more human, forgiving, generous, and with empathy. Example, harmonious coexistence of car users, bikers, and pedestrians in a road. So it might be a bit abstract, but yeah, your views are welcome.
No, I don't think it's abstract at all. Actually, in the study that I showed about cyclist women, it was so amazing to find some concepts that I wasn't expecting to find. Like, for example, cycling is good for democracy, it's good for empowering women, it's good for freedom, it's good for health. So well, health is something that we can suspect, but the other things were not something that I was expecting when I was doing the research. And I think it's important to go to the hardcore of the thing as well, to see how cycling infrastructure is helping or being a barrier for women to cycle more. And this is why this second part of the research was focused more on understanding what are the aspects of the built environment that can help. So, for example, lighting, or the segregators, or the quality of the pavement, or if people, for example, guards are in the parking lots or the parking areas for cycling, or like, what are the things that make more possible for women to cycle? And I think it's important to go deep and really to find out what are the aspects that are barriers and what are the aspects that we can actually improve in a very easy way. We can actually make this very easy for local municipalities or local communities to improve these things. And then probably the next step is this ambiguous area that I think is super, super important, how we actually incorporate women to these care, mobility, or care roles that Giulia mentioned before, or how we facilitate things for women to be mobile with these sustainable infrastructure as well. But thank you for the question. I think it was not ambiguous at all.
I'm just looking at the question and answer box, whether there are any more questions. No.
Could I ask something? Sorry for jumping in. Can I, Debapriya?
Yes, go on, please.
Okay, so and apologize. It may well be very abstract as well, but I just wonder how this ties in, because one of my first encounters with questions of mobility, cycling versus car mobility, and so on was when I first started reading on China and what happened there. And one of the first papers that I wrote basically outlined how China had to trade in its membership in the World Trade Organization for its opening up to the international automobile market. So they were very much opposed to this, but basically were forced into this opening up to cars and getting rid of their cycling culture in order to be able to join the World Trade Organization. So obviously there are, so again, I guess my question goes into a direction with which I'm simply not familiar, but which continues to spark my curiosity. And this is how this all ties in with economic considerations, because obviously all your policymakers and politicians will be interested in growing the economy, and all of that is tied to fossil oil and its use, and to the car industry, and so on and so on. So what kind of convincing is it going to take in order to actually make that leap and get rid of this advantage of the car, if you want, that it really is a driver for the growth of economies wherever you look, wherever you have a capitalism-based society. And I don't know if that goes way beyond the scope of your project, which I think is an absolutely fascinating project, but I do think that somehow we tend to disregard the economic aspects of things, and they turn out to be very important.
No, I think this is a great question, because actually this is the way we need to start translating all these kind of theoretical sometimes concepts and sometimes idealistic concepts as well of how should we be mobile in cities, I think. So the challenge of car is an enormous thing in the region and in the world, but we also know a lot of disadvantages in the long term of the use of car. So we have more and more evidence as well, like showing us in the face, like what are the tremendous problems that we're creating by constructing more highways, more space in the roads for cars. So I totally understand that this is part of the economy, and for example, in the current circumstances, it's so difficult to go for the option of public transport, and I totally get that. But actually, I also get all the benefits of using more sustainable transport modes, as the bicycle or walking, which is also kind of a mode for moving around. And so I also believe that through policymaking, we should facilitate people to go for these options. So you can always have the option of car, and it will be really uncomfortable. In cities, for example, in Mexico City, it's impossible to ride a car for less than 2 hours in peak hour. And so it will get more and more uncomfortable, but also more and more problematic for climate change. So now we're all COVID thing, but the next global problem will be climate change. And so we are going to be late if we are still with this kind of reasoning about the use of car for improving economy and for improving their relationships internationally with all the partners. So I think we have to shift, and probably this is the right moment for doing this shift. So this is what I think should happen. Or no?
Yeah, I think I was about to ask an infrastructure related question, and there's already one in the question answer. So the question is, great overview of the LA situation. What are your thoughts on the temporariness of the cycle infrastructure built in LA as part of the COVID-19 mitigation measures? It worries me that these temporary cycle lanes can be easily removed as things go back to normal, especially in places where cycle lanes are highly contested.
Yeah, I totally agree with the question. I think it's a good question. I've never been a fan of temporary infrastructure, kind of these, what is the name?
Quick fixes.
Yeah, but it's, I understand they can be removed, but I also think people get used to things. So if a street got rid of a lane, then people will get used to find, and if you're a driver, you will find another path, or if you're a cyclist, you'll be so comfortable with that temporarily cycling lane that you won't stop using it. And it would be so difficult to remove this type of infrastructure. I think with this pandemic thing, it was all so extraordinary and urgent that these measures were kind of in the right place to be put on in the streets and in the mindset of people as well. So I don't think this temporary cycle lanes will be deleted or erased from the streets in the long term. And I really, really hope that they're building more and more. So we have a really, really nice network connecting all the places in all cities. I think it's facilitating people to go around cycling or walking as much as possible. I totally understand that the size of cities, especially in Latin American countries, are enormous. And we have to find the ways of incorporating all the transport modes. And that's why the other part of the thing was public transport and doing safety, taking your bicycle with you in the train or in the bus or in the metro, and try to kind of fix a way for people to feel more comfortable going around without the car.
There are lots and lots of questions coming in. If you would like to answer some of the questions yourself, they are directed to you in the question answer box. And I think there's one question about why is there higher public transport use during pandemic in Lima compared to other regions? This is one question even I would like to know the answer to.
Yeah, I don't really know the answer. It was amazing to find this difference in particularly in the case of Lima. I think it was, I don't want to make up an answer for this, because I think this is a serious issue. And I think this is worth taking a deep look. So in the case of Lima, we will see. Please send me your email and we will take a look on this question more in depth. And for Maca, also Chilean, working on public spaces, I totally see how these mobility and public space issues converge in the use of the street. I think, for example, this idea of open up the streets for pedestrians and closing up for not all the streets, but some strategic streets in most of the municipalities is a tremendous idea for letting people to go out. In some municipalities, the public realm is not in very good state, and this is kind of a commonality for many cities. So going out and asking people to go out safely, it's kind of impossible because the space for pedestrian is too small. So if you open up the streets, or some strategic streets, just for walking and for cycling, and actually for going out with your family, with your kids, it's a great alternative for municipalities with lower income or less quality public spaces. So they can just go out and they don't have to look for a park or ride or kind of drive to go to a park to kind of walk. So I think it's a good alternative as well.
Yeah.
I'm Margarete. I know you yeah, from the university. Yeah.
Okay, that's nice. It's such a small world.
Yeah.
Right. So I think we've overrun again, like all the other sessions earlier. But I would like to thank all the panelists. Anna has had to leave early. But Beatriz, thank you, Beatriz. Thank you, Giulia, for a very engaging presentation and very engaging discussion as well. So all the recordings are available on the YouTube channel of SAS Infra, and hope everyone can join us for the next week Infra Plus talk on Southeast Asia. So yeah, see you soon.
Thank you very much. Thanks.